This is a clip from my video on the premiere of The Rings of Power. Based off the trailers and the buzz around the show, I had written down some pre-established assumptions that this show would completely bastardize Lord of the Rings, but for the most part, it does not. Yeah, so I completely lied to your face. I meant it at the time, but this is one of the most false notions I've ever expressed in my life. Now that I've seen the entirety of the first season of Rings of Power, I am here to make recompense for the atrocities I spoke in that video. The Rings of Power is a prime example of the horrors of soulless corporations soiling beloved IPs. It is the epitome of misunderstanding the source material and getting the core DNA wrong. If you had ever taken a ground-level basics writing class, this series would not have been written the way it is because it's amateur at best. This is an embarrassment to the Lord of the Rings name and should be crucified as a laughingstock to all television creators. Let's analyze elements of the screenplay to understand why this is the case. Chapter 1. Development Problems. Take a look at all these movies. Each of these are films that were released in the last few years that I personally love and hold in high regard. All of these movies collectively were made for the sum total of about one single episode of The Rings of Power, and there are 8 episodes. In my first video on The Rings of Power, I spoke about the irony of Amazon, one of the biggest industries in the world, adapting a story so strongly against the advances of industrialism. Coming from Amazon, they have unlimited resources to make every single one of these episodes as expensive as needed. But what they cannot buy with that money is talent, passion, and good storytellers. Beyond not having the talent gene pool though, if we look into the history of the production of The Rings of Power, it becomes very evident that Amazon consciously made decisions to distance themselves from those who love and respect the source material from Tolkien. During the writing phase of the project, lore experts guiding the project were pushing back against some of the directions of the story because it was contradicting the books. These lore experts were fired. Amazon continued without them. Even for the horrifying claim that the entire story was birthed within a single night, which in itself is a massive red flag, we can see from reports over the years that the series took many different forms and ideas until they finally landed on the idea that is before us today. A big part of this is because if you do some research, you'll find that Amazon doesn't actually have the rights to the entire universe. They bought The Hobbit, the core trilogy, and the appendices to The Return of the King. The stories they are telling from the Second Age of Middle-earth are actually from the Silmarillion and the extended works, which they don't even have the proper rights to. When viewing the Lord of the Rings trilogy, it's clear that Jackson understood the source material was sufficient for everything he needed. But Amazon takes the fragments of these stories that they can get their hands on from the appendices, and then writes around it as if they could do a better job than Tolkien did with his own universe. Initially, I was under the impression that this was a mostly faithful adaptation that was filling in the gaps to make it a fluent experience. But it's clear that the creators probably didn't even read the original source material because of the degree to which they butcher and maim the lore and story. They also push their own agendas that are not only unnecessary additions to the story, but these choices actively fight against the intent of Tolkien's works. As an example, we can look at the diversification schemes within the Rings of Power. The Lord of the Rings was originally written as a mythology for England. For that, the characters represent those of English heritage. Just like the mythologies of the Greeks would represent the Greeks, the mythologies of China would represent their peoples, as would the mythologies of African peoples or any other respective groups. There is nothing insulting about focusing your story to speak about a subset of people and then do so with accuracy. The Northman was recently criticized for its lack of diversity even though it is set in 9th century Europe, and the casting decisions accurately reflect those people groups because the film has an interest in historical accuracy. It's not offensive to tell a meaningful story, but it is offensive to rip apart the intentions of good art in the name of serving your own agendas. These lengths in the Rings of Power to diversify the cast don't necessarily ruin the moment-to-moment watching experience of the show, but I have a problem with it because they're a great example of the disconnect between Amazon and Tolkien, corporations versus artists, purpose versus propaganda. This muddies the water and distills the beauty of Lord of the Rings. There were rumors that this show would feature a lot of nudity to ride off the wave of Game of Thrones, but thankfully those did not turn out to be true because this would have been a massive slap to the face of Tolkien and his pursuit of purity. Chapter 2. Stupid Story Approach. The story of The Forging of the Rings is all about a political fight for power and stake in Middle-earth. It's about the relationships between races and how the Forging of the Rings was meant to keep the realm in balance, but it was a deceptive plan led to lead them under the control of Sauron. Instead of being a high-tension political thriller between races and civilizations, though, the hook of The Rings of Power is that it wants us to guess which character Sauron is. I repeat, it wants us to guess which character Sauron is. It gives us a bunch of characters who could potentially be Sauron in disguise, and lets us play a guessing game as the show's primary interest. But it inherently doesn't matter who Sauron is if we don't properly establish what is at stake and what relation Sauron has to the matter. It banks off the hope that we understand Sauron from the Lord of the Rings films rather than creating actual character dynamics within this. We substitute good character-based storytelling for uninteresting MacGuffins based upon shaky pieces of lore that are half made up. Any decision the show makes to differentiate itself from the Lord of the Rings trilogy just makes it worse, which I talk about in depth in my first video. This is just embarrassing in every comparison. On paper, some of the events that happen in the story are fine and interesting, but the way that each of these beats are presented makes it feel like nothing is happening at all. Everything is so poorly communicated that it's more moving to read a bullet point list of all the things that happened in the show. There aren't many things that happen anyways, though. This is an 8.5-hour piece of entertainment that feels like a prologue. The title is The Rings of Power, but we don't ever see a single ring until the very end of the season. This leads me to the next topic. Chapter 3. Nothing happens. The main thrust of the show is reserved until the very last episode of the season, where they tell you to wait until season 2 for the actual story. This TV show literally farts around and accomplishes nothing for 8 episodes. If you were to pick up at the last episode and just watch the minute-long previously on the Rings of Power bit, you would be filled in and ready to go. Episode 5 is the most egregious example of this. It starts with the characters boarding some warships to sail to Middle-earth, and then an hour later, we finally see the ships raise anchor and set sail for real. I am not kidding. The character arcs in this season are wholly unacceptable. Here are a few examples of the journeys the characters take over this season. Isildur is part of the ship guard but wants something more. There's constant back and forth banter between his father that doesn't really go anywhere until he's fired from the ship guard. But then he talks to his father again and he makes it back into the ship guard. Yeah, that's it. The stranger is a fish out of water Gandalf who's gathering his bearings and hardly can speak English. But then in the last episode they forget about that and suddenly he speaks fluently for literally no reason. He also decides to turn from evil and join the good side, but this is such a boring and obvious arc that I think his speech impediments are more amusing. Galadriel is a piece of garbage in this show who frolics around the country committing genocide in the name of revenging her brother, but then she comes to terms with it and decides to be a selfless person. Her motivation throughout the show looks something like this.
Why do you keep fighting? Why do you keep fighting?
Because I cannot stop.
Bronwyn is a healer from the Southlands who magically takes over commanding all of the Southlands for no reason. There's no justification for this. This is one of the worst parts of the show. Nothing makes any sense or feels good about it. Theo is an annoying teen who can't do anything but feed the schemes of the enemy until Galadriel promotes him to a soldier for no reason. The arcs are so weak that I don't even know who half these characters are. I had to look up the name of Theo on IMDb just to write this script. This girl, for instance, I think she's important, but she's pretty much just Hermione Granger, so that's what I was calling her. My problem is not just that so little happens in the show either. It's also that every single moment, no matter how promising or not, is completely trashed by horrible writing. Chapter 4. Moment-to-moment writing. A. Contradictions. The entire show feels like the writers never had the scripts to the previous episodes. There are constant glaring contradictions. The Harfoots are set up as a heartfelt community who have to stay together. They try to sabotage each other on their trips. They consider throwing away certain families for their own benefit. They're an absolutely horrible set of people that I despise, but then in the next episode that doesn't exist. But then, it does again. In episode 7, the Queen of Numenor is blinded in an eruption, but she insists that no one see her like that. In the next scene, she is publicly wearing a blindfold. For some reason, there's sexual tension between Galadriel and Halbrand, but they reveal that Galadriel has a husband out of nowhere who she's very loyal to. This doesn't make any sense together. B. Fake outs. The show has exactly 0 stakes. It never proves to me that any characters are at risk. In episode 6, there's a Bronwyn death fake out that was very obvious. And just to flex their writing proficiency, they decided to put another Bronwyn death fake out right after it in episode 7. It happens twice, back to back. Another example of what I'm talking about is during the aftermath of the eruption of Mount Doom. The way it's shot tries to make us think that many have died, and it tells us to be sad, but it becomes evident that not a single actual character in the story was hurt, only extras brought on set to die. They do show Isildur getting crushed under a flaming house, but if you know anything about Lord of the Rings, it's obvious that this is just a fake out waiting to be revealed. And even if you aren't familiar with the story, based upon the history of fake outs, you could assume this, and it confirms it to you when his horse runs back to him. C. Exposition. In my first video on the Rings of Power, I went into detail on why the exploration of this world is so much rougher in the Rings of Power than in Lord of the Rings. We don't have a protagonist like Frodo who is learning of the world with us. Because of this, as the show delivers its exposition, it always feels forced. The words, "it is said," constantly comes from many of the characters' mouths. They start explaining some bit of history which every single character in the room should already know. There's no sense of proper context as to why anyone should need this information, so it just makes it agonizing to watch. D. Comic relief. I'm not a fan of forced comic relief that ruins all the serious moments, but this is something that the big industries like Disney and Amazon seem to love. The Rings of Power suffers from this, and there wasn't a single joke in the entire show that I laughed at. I laughed at the show a lot, don't get me wrong, but it was just when it was trying to be serious and failing miserably. Or when the Harfouts caught on fire. Now that brought a smile to my face. An example is in episode 7 when Durin is talking to his wife early on. Chapter 5. Lore. Now, as a preface to this session, I am not a lore master by any stretch of the imagination, but I have read the books, seen the movies, and I know a good amount about the universe. For even that moderate level of knowledge, it becomes immediately evident that Amazon is just tearing this universe to shreds. Let's look at some examples. The thread about the elves losing their light and only being able to redeem themselves through mithril makes no sense. They act as if the mithril is a new material discovered by the dwarves and kept secret, but Elrond literally knows the name of it when he sees it. Not only does this ruin the nature of the spiritually superior elves, but it doesn't even make sense within the self-contained episode because Elrond proves that it wasn't just discovered. We have a Balrog wake up because someone threw a leaf. That sentence probably sounds stupid, but just watch the show and you'll see what I mean. This is a desperate plea to get people to keep watching, but it isn't even paid off in this season. We never actually see the Balrog do anything. The Balrog in the lore doesn't wake up until a few thousand years later during the greed of the dwarves, because it's the evil consequences cast upon them. But it just looks so darn neat that Amazon decided to go ahead and wake up the big boy and break all of its meaning. In the story, there are essential characters that teach Sauron how to forge the Rings of Power that they don't have the rights to in this show. So instead, their genius idea was to make Celebrimbor, the greatest smith in Middle-earth, to have the IQ of 10, and Sauron tell him exactly how to make them. For some reason, the most acclaimed smith of all time had never thought of the idea of combining metals, one of the most basic smithing concepts on the planet. So when disguised Sauron shows up, he introduces the idea to Celebrimbor as if it's a novel concept that gets the rings forged. Not just once, but twice, Sauron tells him exactly how to get the rings forged. Sauron has zero development in this show. He doesn't learn anything from the elves. He just tells them what to do and then laughs at them. The entire concept of him making the one ring to rule them all, too, is because he realizes rings of power were made in secret to make sure someone like him could not abuse their power. But in this show, he is the one at the forefront of the project, so this just instantly destroys half the interesting tension of the story. They ship Galadriel and Sauron as a couple? Yeah, I'm just gonna move on from that one. Next up, the approach to the orcs being reanimated elves is controversial to say the least. This is a bit of lore that Tolkien redacted because it would imply that the orcs would go on to the Grey Havens after death, but he did not want evil to see any type of saving grace in the end. The show decides to embrace this disowned lore idea in order to play a sympathy card for them, which doesn't even work very well in execution. If you listen to how the Queen of Numenor addresses her father, you'll realize that she was disgracing him by the title that she gives him, just because the writers don't understand how the titles of Numenor work. Speaking of titles, the name Durin is one of honor within the Dwarven race. There are never 2 or more consecutive Durins, only 1. But here, they're just 2 for kicks. Woohoo! We have a few villains who go in search of Sauron throughout the show, and when they're defeated in the last episode, they turn into ringwraiths. This is one of the most insulting pieces of it all to me, honestly, because there aren't even any rings of power yet because the show is so incompetent. So there's literally no way that there could have been ringwraiths. The rings corrupt these kings and turn them into ringwraiths. But they are incapable of making memorable villains on their own, so instead they just ignore the entire meaning of what a ringwraith is and steal the character designs from Jackson, just so stupid members of the audience can go, "Oh yeah, I remember that." These examples are barely scratching the surface of the lore problems in the Rings of Power, but I don't claim to be an expert, nor do I want this video to be 4 hours long, so for now, let's just move on. Chapter 6. Manipulation. If we look at episode 3, we can realize how severely the show suffers from a false sense of importance. In this scene around the tree, we have a moment where this elf character, who I can't remember the name of because the writing sucks, is forced to chop down a tree while in orc custody. This is, of course, a dishonor and emotionally terrible thing for an elf to have to do because of their connection to the forests. But there is never any setup to why the trees will be important to the elves within the show, so it just comes off as forced. Worse though, in my opinion, is how in this same scene they treat the deaths of the side characters. A few of these prisoners try to escape and they are shot in the back. The way that they choose to present this is by going slow motion and playing overly dramatic music and then having our main elf cry in agony like his mother was just killed. We have never seen these characters before. I do not care about these characters, but it's insisting we should in the most dramatic fashion it can manage. The problem I have with this is that when you present a nobody's death in this way, it will feel no different than when you kill a major character, because this is as dramatic as you can get. Being dramatic about nothing will destroy the drama of what is actually important. This is just a blatant misunderstanding in how to orchestrate dramatic emotion. It has to have pacing. Let's talk about the music in the show. It never matches what is on screen except arguably in episode 6. It is always far more dramatic than what is happening on screen and just makes it feel cheesy and unearned. Every time a character gives a speech, they have a group of people around them to cheer and holler and stir up energy and emotion from the words. But it's hilarious because their speeches are so uninspiring and dull, and the figures delivering them are laughable, so this is all just cringe. None of the poetic nature of Tolkien is found in this show. It constantly tries to insist emotion upon you, but I think there was only ever one emotional beat that felt earned even partially throughout the entire 8 episodes, which is when Durin and his father argue. Chapter 7. It's just lame. This chapter is self-evident. Episode 6, when the Númenóreans finally set sail to Middle-earth and wage war, was hailed as a masterpiece. It had action for the first time in the entire series, but the scale, writing, and characters are all so bad that there's no way I could care about any of the action. There are no stakes in this battle. This is embarrassing compared to any of the battles in Lord of the Rings. These Númenóreans are one of the most epic civilizations in all of Middle-earth. Giant warriors who storm Middle-earth and eventually destroy themselves by fighting God himself because they want a way into heaven. Here in this show though, they're annoying brats who have to be taught by Galadriel how to even hold a sword. There is no way I'll ever believe these are the Númenóreans, let alone the guys who will defeat Sauron. I already talked about it, but let's just reiterate that the greatest smith of them all doesn't know how to smith. There's a teleportation problem in the series where the characters can travel all the way across the map instantaneously, even though the journey of traveling from the Shire to Mordor is the entire thrust of the structure of the Lord of the Rings. This teleportation undermines that entire intention built within the precisely mapped out world of Middle-earth. Okay, I can't talk about this anymore. I'm done. If I were to rank the episodes, this is probably what it would look like. Overall, the show, I would give it like a 3 out of 10. I am not going to be watching this anymore, so don't expect coverage of Season 2. I disrespect the show in every way imaginable. Avoid this show at all costs. For a follow-up to more television content, I'll be covering the first season of House of Dragon next week when it finishes airing, which is a much better show than this so far. Stay tuned for when I'll be discussing the script of Black Adam this upcoming Friday. Thanks for watching this episode, guys. If you enjoyed it or found it informative, do me a favor and leave it a like and subscribe. If you thought the video could have been better though, first leave it a thumbs down and then explain to me what I should fix in the comments below. Thanks guys, I'll see you later.